também às 9 horas, na sala do Panteão. Depois nós temos, no dia 2 de dezembro, 14 horas, o professor Francisco Ramela, da Universidade de Turim, com uma conferência Inovação e Desenvolvimento Social, Panteão, 14 horas. O professor Ramela também apresentará outra conferência, dia 9 de 12, Mudanças Atuais, Relações Universidade e Empresa. Depois, no dia 3 de dezembro, o lançamento do livro O Trabalho Horizonte 2021, lá no Bonfim, na Palavraria, às 19 horas. E na quinta-feira, dia 4, e sexta-feira, dia 5 pela manhã, uma série de palestras com os mais importantes sociólogos do trabalho, que vão discutir o futuro do trabalho. São 11 pesquisadores importantes, né, vários colegas nossos aqui. E esse evento tem vagas limitadas, inscrições obrigatórias na PE. As inscrições podem ser feitas aqui, mas ele acontecerá na Fundação de Economia e Estatística, no centro da cidade. Depois, não terminou ainda, a professora, no dia 5, também sexta-feira, às 15 horas, professora Yulia Melik, da Universidade de Moscou, fará uma palestra sobre a doutrina do eurasianismo. Então, vocês vejam, um conjunto de atividades muito interessantes, com pesquisadores e professores de várias partes do mundo. Então, um lembrete aos nossos alunos de pós-graduação: essas atividades são altamente recomendadas. Nós temos uma diretriz regimental que indica a obrigatoriedade de participar dos eventos que o pós-graduação promove. Bom, eu sugiro que a gente comece. Então, acabou de chegar o Paulo. Então, aproveito para convidar os nossos três palestrantes de hoje: professora Elisa Reis, professora Lorena Holzmann e professor Paulo Pérez. Por favor. Boa tarde novamente. Vamos iniciar.
Good afternoon again. Let's resume the session of the International Seminar, Civil Society, Democracy and Contestation, 30 years of redemocratization in Brazil. We have the pleasure of having with us Professor Elisa Reis, professor of the University of Rio de Janeiro, member of the Academy of Sciences, Brazilian, our collaborator in several conferences. Professor Elisa Reis has international production and insertion, both for her books, articles, and is very active in the most important scientific societies of social sciences. I don't remember the title of your presentation, your lecture. Well, she's going to say it soon. We also have the presence of Professor Lorena Holzmann, professor of sociology of our graduation program. She works on sociology of work or labor sociology. We have some collaboration mainly in the organization of the dictionary Work and Technology. And during the next week, she will be launching a book, Control and Discipline of the Labor Force, Strategies and Resistance. Our third participant, Professor Paulo Perez from the Department of Political Science, Professor of Political Science graduation program with research works on the party system in Brazil. We are going to have lectures from 30 to 35 minutes, and then we are going to have a Q&A session or debate session. Welcome. Thank you. I'd like to start saying that it is a pleasure for me to be here. I'd like to thank for the invitation. And also, I'd like to tell you about my perplexity, what to say about 30 years of democracy in Brazil. I was hesitating. That's why the title was Balance and Perspectives of Democracy in Brazil, because I really didn't know what to focus on. I was in doubt if I should talk about any of my research, but I decided that not. I have been for a long time in this area, so I have a history, memory on this period, and I'm going to talk about that. I don't have a PowerPoint. I just have this program, and I will talk about the relationship between history and philosophy on the social sciences. I remember the first time I came here, and it was in a book called Generalizations and Singularity in the Social Sciences. I think that to remember that title is very adequate, because during these 30 years of democratization, our themes or topics that are always historic have varied a lot. It is essential to think about the present, but it's good also to have in mind the idea of the important historic processes. I would like to start talking about the ups and downs of democracy in Brazil, the obstacles in democracy. And my PhD thesis was on agrarian roots, on the authoritarian modernization in Brazil. And I remember on Simon Schwarzman, Bolivar Lamounier, myself, all of us were discussing about the authoritarian period in Brazil and the history roots. Fortunately, it is not updated, this topic anymore. It is old, and our history obstacles, our genetic roots, origins are still remembered by ourselves, because it has consequences in shaping our democracy. But we have to recognize that we have a democracy, and rediscovering this is something remote. It's interesting because we forget everything, the authoritarian period, very fast. I was commenting with a friend that when I developed my thesis, the title was Interests of Classes, and I had to change it because classes was not allowed to use that word. I changed it with the word groups. But fortunately, we overcame that moment. Now we have a kind of spring of democratization. And in this context, I remembered working with debureaucratization at that time. It was before the Constituent Assembly of 1988. There was an effort of putting the citizen closer to the state, and I started studying this, and the minister was stimulating the persons to write to him to denounce cases of bureaucracy. And he used to say, I'm going to answer to everyone. And his team did it. But the denounces were lack of employment, lack of houses, health. The persons and people were asking for the basic rights as the government was obliged to give these things. And as the answer from the minister was always saying, keep saying, keep asking, keep denouncing, I concluded at that time that he was reinforcing a dependency discourse. The dialogue with the citizen was reinforcing his the dependence. He didn't like it. The book was never published, but the idea of liberalization, of debureaucratization, was the first step of our current democracy. In this context was also calling my attention the valuing of the notion of democracy. And in this authoritarian context was common to hear from the left-wing intellectuals that citizenship was some liberal bourgeois concept. It took some time for us to realize the importance of the civil rights and the habeas corpus, and all that was learned during the dictatorship. In this context of the 80s, this value of the citizenship brought as something new the association, the rescue of Tocqueville, that was also an author that was considered liberal and bourgeois, and suddenly became something important for Brazilian intellectuals. In the 90s, the concern with the institutional engineering dominated the scenario. We talked a lot about design and the intellectual design, of how important it is for democracy. But in this context, the idea of social debt emerges strongly. We are a democracy, but we are in debt in terms of social rights. And this concern with the social rights caused several concepts as delegation, democracy, bureaucratic gap, social debt, are all concepts that are part of our lack of confidence in the democracy before the euphoria of the 80s. In this context of democratic deficit, there's a new movement that emerged, but it was like disappointment. In Brazil, as well as in some other countries, the postmodernism was considered as the end of the promises of the social sciences, or the end of history. All the pessimistic ideas that were like a mark of the end of the century. We see that the history didn't finish and is full of incidents and accidents, and somehow we are reshaping our social science and trying to find ways of improving our what we call lato sensu democracy. In this new scenario, some days ago I was wondering about what are the immediate challenges. I'm not thinking of that on my own. There are so many immediate needs that I thought, well, let me try to simplify a little bit, to elaborate. I had to speak about that last week, and I considered that if I had to choose 3 immediate needs, I would say that first, in the institutional design, we have a legal risk or legal political risk. What to do with the judicial power? I don't believe in that a political reform will come without any other support. Who is going to, well, this reform of the juridical scheme, I think this is a problem that we have to face. Besides this, if I think as democracy, as freedom, equality, what affects it from my standpoint, if I have to add, of course, the risks to freedom to each group, class, but if I had to add, I would say that public safety is the threat, the main threat to freedom in Brazil. Not being afraid of police, and to be able to go and come from freely, and as a challenge or as a threat to equality. I think that after some research, or the consensus in Brazil when we talk about inequality, is education. That is, when we, experts or non-experts, when you ask what we should do to reduce inequality, they always say, people say education. If there is a consensus, why don't we go ahead? And here I think that the problem, the issue is that the opportunities equality is not enough, and to have an education that is key to reduce inequalities, we should think about conditions equalities and not only opportunities equality. We are a little far from the solution for that, because we are trying to solve it from top down. We are trying to create conditions equality in the university education, but in elementary education we still think of opportunities equality, and with this we are still going to have some inequalities. All this if I think about Brazil, but I want to go ahead and I want to think about the global context and the national context together. In these 30 years of democracy in Brazil, we have had an intensification of communication flow that was immense. It is clear when having the programs in the next week, it is clear the intense links we have with the rest of the world. It is a contrast with Brazil in the past. From the standpoint of communication, finances, labor force, all that has made us much more connected. We have also observed along this period because the new dimensions of the collective action. Along these 30 years, it has changed a lot. When I think that in the beginning of democratization in the 80s, persons were excited with the emergence of association of inhabitants and with the collective. And also in the Brazilian context and the global context, this proliferation of forms that were not expected of participation are connected to a crisis of representativeness. productivity. It is like a demographic problem. It's almost a demographic problem. When Rousseau thought of democracy, he thought of 100,000 people. Then when Tocqueville talked about the art, the arena, the art of association, was the persons were a minority when thinking about that. The increase of the political sphere and the diversity of interests make inefficient the traditional forms of representation, and we do not have response for that. So I mean that these are the problems that we share with the rest of the world. The crisis of the democratic design as conceived classically. This agenda, both the Brazilian agenda, where I have mentioned several threats, and also in the broader scenario, would be a complication for our social sciences. But I would like to concentrate my comments on the cultural transformations of these 30 years and also the challenges they bring to the social sciences. Of course, the world is always changing, and we always think that there's more transformation than ever. But to make a parallel with the great transformation in the past, I think that we are living a change in the way we see the world as we haven't seen maybe for 200 years. I am considering that the current cultural transformations are equivalent to the great transformation that originated the transformation into capitalism. And this great cultural transformation implies other transformations too. But I want to think of the ways of looking at the world because it affects immediately our research focus. And I would mention three important transformations. One of them has to do, or is the way to conceive the relationship between humans and nature. There's something else embedded here, because in the past we say man, nature. Now we say human being and nature. And this transformation, why am I highlighting this change in the perception of the relationship between human being and nature? If I look at what happened 200 years ago, the new perception at that period, I think that the nature should be conquered. I think we are living something similar when we see that and we know that nature has to be protected. In the past, persons were protecting themselves from nature. Persons were trying to shelter, to dress, because God or the nature would cause some harm. When coming to the modern world, when we started conceiving nature not as something that I have to protect from, but of something that I have to conquer, the notion of the world being in development forever became possible. It wasn't possible in the past. When you thought that nature was an imperative and you had to protect, we were used to the idea of cycles, of dangers, of when we started thinking that nature is there to be conquered and with technology we are going to be developed, there was this new notion of development in the social scientists' vocabulary and the common sense vocabulary. And we lived with that for years. The sense or the idea of material progress always with having the idea of developing as something natural. When you say the GDP is not growing, it seems is an anomaly, but we are also changing this standpoint when we conclude that if we keep on conquering nature, we are going to kill the golden eggs hen. We have to help, we have to protect nature to have a possible development. So this notion of sustainability is as radical as it was 200 years ago to believe that development was possible. As social scientists, I think we have not solved this problem. And as natural scientists also, some time ago, I organized an event called Dialogue Between Social and Natural Scientists about our challenges, current challenges. But at the end, it was a very satisfactory dialogue. We developed our curiosity, and we know that we have to invest more on that. I see in the Science Academy how difficult it is, and also in the context of the International Science Council, because we have several programs focusing on sustainability, risk management, food security, and these are topics that are still limited in our agenda, and they are not well connected or don't communicate well with natural sciences. Now, due to my insertion in these academies, I have all these participation, and we have the contribution of the social sciences have been just minoritary. And I think this is the first large transformation in the way we think the world. There is a second element that I think that affects our research agenda is what we consider our resources of social organization. In this sense, as social sciences and the public in general, we used to think that societies had two basic organizational resources: authority or state, and interest or market resource. So we would classify societies as more market or more state. These were two basic resources. And some years ago, the last 3 decades, we felt that we start having the notion that the society itself is an organizational resource, and this comes together with the rescue of the concept of civil society. Everyone used to say that it was a Hegelian concept, idealist concept, and by the end of the 20th century, we start talking about the civil society when we want to say that the society has different resources from the state and from the market. These 3 parties way, and not dual anymore, of seeing the society has unexploited characteristics, and it has included in the 3 actors some lack of security as about the consequences. The market has notions that put him closer to the state. When we talk about corporative social responsibility, in the conventional arrangement, social responsibility was the state responsibility. When we have this value of the corporative social responsibility, being it genuine or instrumental, the fact is that it is a value that is highlighted as typical from the market. From the state standpoint, I see the same thing. we talk about efficiency, the minimum state. Efficiency was typical from the market and not from the state, but now it's part of the state agenda. And together with this, we have the notion that the civil society is an organizational resource. This came very clearly in the old book from Alan Wolf, Housekeeper. He called the attention to tasks that neither the market nor the state were developing. Housekeeper is the name of the book. He was living in the Scandinavian countries, and he would say that if a couple wanted to have children, they had to plan at least for 7 years ahead, because, well, then because of to have place in a kindergarten. So they give us several failures in the society that were obliging the society to find new solutions. This coincides when solidarity became popular and evident and famous mainly in Poland with democratization, and in that Polish context, and also in the case of Brazil, there was a valorization of the civil society. We say that solidarity had to impose itself against the authoritarian state and the savage capitalism. In the case of Poland, it was curious because as the state was responsible for everything, they tend to put solidarity and market together in its origin.
So, to study this phenomenon, I think many entrance points are possible. What I did, because I was very curious to understand these new forms of social organization, I decided to study one of the manifestations of civil society, which were the NGOs. So I took the NGOs as a proxy of civil society. So I did a broad study that involved survey, depth analysis, focus groups with beneficiaries of NGOs, in order to get to know how they saw themselves, and it's incredible, and how they define themselves over against the state and the market. Last year, I edited a book on the basis of that project, where I'm the editor. All the papers are written by students of mine who did dissertations on this. That shows how wide is this range of possibilities of studying this new configuration of society that is proposed as an organizational resource. And finally, the third big change that I wanted to comment on, which is also not new, has no novelty, is the re-emergence of difference as a relevant notion. I'm thinking, for example, of the long process of creation of the nation states in Europe, and also then in the third world, where the idea of the formation of the national states implied naturally in bringing the idea of equality as opposed to the naturalized differences that characterized the traditional period, the medieval world. So at that point, it was very progressive for you to conceal the differences and bring to the surface equality, the universal equality of all individuals and so forth. This had quite progressive consequences, as I just said, but from the very beginning, the differences paid the price for that process. That is, it took a long time until the difference of gender was recognized as something positive rather than negative. not to mention the minorities that were devastated in this process, both in the European context, but mainly in the post-colonial context. And we then, in the last decades, realize that it's no longer possible to conceal the idea of difference. The very social complexity, the complexity of interest that I mentioned earlier, makes it imperative to realize that the difference is, the recognition of difference is essential for the affirmation of equality. This is actually, we all know that, we all feel that that's way, but it's difficult to solve this in logical terms, and even more difficult in terms of social policies. Now, if I think, for instance, the idea of equality and difference. First, the very notion of inequality did not exist before the modern world, because the opposite of equal was different. So socially, we created a notion of inequality that was fundamental for various accomplishments, as something which is the opposite of equality. But suddenly we do need a reconfiguration, because when we took equality and inequality as exclusive and encompassing, comprehensive notions, we condemned many people, many groups, and many interests to an eternal inequality. That's why there is a need to reconfigure an analytical scheme in order to include difference as being complementary to equality. Also, the most advanced research agenda so far is perhaps this. Many people at the philosophical level, at the practical level, at the level of public policies has already dwelt into these topics. But there's still a lot of research to be done along these lines, and in the present I am part of a research project, that tries to apprehend that. So how do you bring these two notions of equality and difference together? I am part of a research project that compares how blacks in New York and in Rio de Janeiro deal with stigma, with discrimination, with prejudice. Because what interested us was to see how people experience that. I have never worked at this psychosocial level, but I was curious precisely to understand this, and Michelle Lamore invited me to join the project. I did. In order to complicate things, she included a few additional minorities. Israel, and in the case of Israel, 3 minorities and not just one. We have Ethiopians, we have the Jews of Arab origin, we have, of course, the Palestinians. So at the same time as this complicates our research design and makes it less elegant, it does throw light on it. You can see how in completely different ways, but ultimately in convergent ways, people feel equal and different at the same time. And in the case of Brazil, there's no novelty in this, but to see this, to experienced and expressed by people themselves is quite incredible. Because you have always known in Brazil we have this big tension between class and color. But almost always this was mentioned as something that the white elite used to impose. Probably this is true, but how this is internalized and experienced is something striking. The reports that we have by people, when you ask them to talk about experiences of discrimination, people say, no, I have never been discriminated against. Usually that's the natural answer of people. But then when you begin to talk with them, the episodes of discrimination begin to surface. But almost in 100% of the cases, with rare exceptions, the people hesitate. They don't know to define whether they have been victims either of class or race discrimination, which creates an immense difficulty about how to react, how to respond. There's a big contrast in this respect with the U.S. When you interview New Yorkers, population of New York, there is no doubt for these people. People know exactly where is the barrier between the border between class and color. But in our case, sometimes there is no doubt that a person has been discriminated against in racial terms, but she asks herself, wonders if I'm fantasizing about this. So for me, this raises a dilemma, not really a dilemma, but a big challenge. How are we going to deal, in democratic terms, with the ambiguities that people experience? How can we think about a democratic agenda where this ambiguity is so intense? So I could continue a lot, but I apologize because I have talked too long. I just want to remind that we do have a democracy that did advance, but we still have face immense challenges, and some of these challenges are shared. I think that whatever is our research area, these three big cultural transformations that I pointed out pose challenges to all of us. This might be a problem, but at the same time, when something is shared by all of us, that makes of us a scientific a community of scientists, and that is a resource which I personally value a lot. Thank you very much.
Elisa, então gostaria de convidar o professor.
Thank you, Professor Elisa. I would like to give the floor to Professor Paulo Pérez to continue our panel. Good afternoon. Thank you, Cattani. I would like to begin by thanking for the invitation, which was very kindly extended to me. At the same time, it raised a serious challenge for me. When I was invited, just a brief story. When I was invited, I said, no, but this is an event of sociology that also deals with a common topic, which is democracy. And I do have a training in sociology at the undergraduate level, but I'm a political scientist. So am I going to approach issues that really are of interest to a sociological approach? But then what I was told that what they wanted precisely was the view of a political scientist on this 30-year process of redemocratization in the country. And then I said, okay, I accepted the invitation, and right away I accepted the division of labor that the invitation implied. So it was an implicit division of labor, an academic division of labor, which was, we should assume that political science might have a different view because it focuses on other things. And in fact, in the past years in Brazil, in these political science, maybe in the past 50 or 60 years in Brazil, beginning in the 1990s, political science, a part of it, not all of it, has really been focusing on some elements, some variables that usually are not focused on primarily by the sociologists, just as sociologists, and focus on variables primarily that political scientists live in the background. So I thought that my contribution could accept this implicit division of labor, which means that I'm going to approach here aspects that a part of political science would call political institutional aspects. So what interests me here is to make an assessment of democracy in Brazil in these 30 years of the process of redemocratization, looking at it from the point of view of the constitutional design, to look at the political system, considering the internal operation of the political system itself, trying to bring, along with the previous contributions that focused on several other aspects of the democratic phenomenon, trying to bring this more institutional perspective. So I'm going to focus here on an assessment that will discuss what we call the governmental arena, in other words, the level of the government, of the relationships between the powers, and also the electoral arena, which focuses on the electoral participation, the political parties, the political party system, to see whether it's possible to make, on the basis of that, to make an assessment about the functioning, the operation of democracy at the institutional level, at the level of the political institutional level, to make an assessment of that from that perspective. Of course, I don't do this alone, because the idea was for me to bring here the view of political science. So actually, I'm bringing the view of a few colleagues, political scientists. As I prepared for this presentation, I surveyed a few data. I thank my master students, Cristiano and Vinicius, who researched some data for me, and also did a small informal survey among colleagues of several political science programs in the country to have an idea of what they, as political scientists, would highlight as advances and challenges still to be faced by democracy in Brazil after these 30 years. Initially, I would say that, yes, we do have various things that we should celebrate, because we are in a country that, as we know, has a long authoritarian tradition of coup d'etats. We had a succession of coup d'etats. And therefore, we now experience an unheard-of period in our democratic history, in which we have an unprecedented period in which we have the longest period of the duration of a democratic regime with direct elections at all levels, at all representative positions. This year, we have just experienced the 7th consecutive presidential election, which in our democratic regime is an unprecedented feat in our history. But obviously, until the protests of last year, which also dominated the agenda in the country, this shows that democracy is still seen with a very critical look by various social actors and social groups in Brazil. Actually, I would say that democracy today is undergoing an intense challenge all over the world. Various problems that we can find in the operation of democracy in Brazil today are problems experienced in various countries, even in older democracies. And I would say that even more, to start my presentation proper, that actually democracy as a political regime is something that is consolidated as a value, as a universal value, or at least a value of universal claim. This also happened very recently, only after World War II, that in a contradictory manner, the favorable views of democracy, I say in a contradictory manner, because also after World War II, beginning in the 1960s, we also have a wave of authoritarianism in various regions of the world and here in Latin America. So, democracy, actually, if you allow me to make a brief theoretical and historical preamble, democracy actually is a regime that encounters serious resistances throughout its history, from the beginning of the first democratic experiment in Athens, in Greece. In antiquity, if you remember the classical division of powers proposed by Aristotle, the typology of the forms of government, we are going to see that since Aristotle, a very negative view of democratic government has been consolidated insofar as democracy was identified as a degenerate government. The good form of government at that time was what they used to call politeia, which was then translated as republic, and that democracy was allegedly a degeneration of politeia, because politeia was a government that has as its goal the interest of everyone, and democracy actually was a form of government of a class. Although the majority of the majority class, but it was a government of the demos. And of course, demos in Greece, as many of you know, were the poor. So this was a government in which the poor gained enormous power, and of course the aristocracy was always very scared with the possibility of having a democratic government. So throughout history, till the 19th century, democracy was always seen with a lot of suspicion. And on the basis of the liberal debate that comes before the 19th century but was consolidated in that century, democracy, seen now in a different way, begins to be increasingly accepted with some resignation, as we're going to find in Tocqueville, who realized it's no use to fight against that phenomenon. But it's important to create mechanisms to control a possible tyranny of the majority, which would come precisely be a result of the unlimited will of the demos. What happens in the 19th century is we have, on the one hand, a liberal domestication, liberal taming of democracy, this introduction of a liberal mechanism designed to control the operation of the majority will, which then has to do with the constitutionalist debate about the division of powers, the debate about the natural rights as a guarantee against the tyranny of the majority. I'm thinking here about Benjamin Constant in Brazil, about Stuart Mill and Tocqueville himself. So therefore, what we have in the 19th century is, in a parallel way, the beginning of the acceptance of the democratic regime, but of a democracy that has nothing to do with the classical experience of antiquity. So this is democracy in its liberal current. Democratic government is then a government in which what is introduced is a principle of representation, the division of powers, and a series of mechanisms designed to avoid what they consider to be the tyranny of the majority. So what we value today as democracy, as a model of democracy in the present, is something that we might call a mixed form of government that contains democratic elements, in the sense that those who govern owe their legitimacy to the popular will, but which at the same time this popular will is divided, controlled, and represented. It is not exercised in a direct way. I think that this already raises a few issues to think about popular demonstrations that have taken place all over the world in the name of a democratic ideal that is somewhat opposed to this liberal ideal of the 20th century. So it is this model of democracy that is at stake when we talk about democracy today. Because before and even in the period of the formation of North American Republic, which is considered the great model of democracy, initial model, the model studied by Tocqueville, we find a very suspicious view of democracy in one of its most important founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, in the quotation you see on the slide, in which he presents his fear of democracy because he thought that democracy is nothing more than the rule of the mob, uncontrolled mob, and therefore this is a government of a majority that may oppress a minority which is sometimes not so small. It may be comprise more than 40% of the population. So there was a fear that democracy might oppress the minorities and the individuals. Now, after of the first half of the 20th century, there is a radical change. Precisely because democracy, favorable to democracy, because democracy begins to be seen as a government in which the majority can be controlled by the mechanisms of the constitutional design. And this brings a radical change in the vision, like in this quotation by Churchill that I bring here. All forms are bad, including democracy. Perhaps it's the least evil, less bad than the other ones. And this little plaque that shows that today in the world, all the theory of the forms of government that always conceived of various alternative forms today has been reduced to two forms. It's either democracy or it is some form of dictatorship. So there is no alternative today to democracy. If somebody talks against democracy today, that person is talking in favor of a dictatorial regime, be it authoritarian, totalitarian, or whatever. And really, this view has been consolidated in such a way that democracy today is the regime that prevails in most countries in the world. I have here data from the Freedom House, whose criteria of classification is always very much criticized, like any other criteria, but I had to use something. So I'm using data from the Freedom House that show that the countries in green, according to this classification of democratic freedoms, liberties, are the countries that are considered fully democratic. The ones in yellow are partially democratic. They have some problems. And the other ones in blue are non-democratic countries. So you can see that there is even a certain territorial division of democracy. The more I move eastwards, the less, well, someone might say, because this criterion of democracy is completely Western. Perhaps we should have a different, but anyway, this division shows two things. There is a territorial division. At the same time, we see the prevalence of democracy today in the world. In fact, I have data here. Beginning in the 1990s, every 5 years, the percentage of democratic countries in the world, and you can see that this figure has been growing. These are data from 2013. In 2013, we had 63% of the countries in the world were democratic according to the criteria of Freedom House. It's not an overwhelming majority, but it is a figure that is quite expressive. So this is the situation of democracy in the world today. Even where there is no democracy, a major part of the motivations that lead to protests have democracy as a driving factor. I have some pictures of demonstrations that took place in the Middle East, and you see that the posters are quite eloquent. Democracy. I like the photo of this little boy here. We want democracy. So where there is no democracy, the struggle is for democracy. So much so that we even have reached a serious situation, a situation in which democracy is taken as a banner for the legitimation of invasion and attacks of countries. So democracy is such a universal value. That is so universal that I can use it as an ideological discourse in order to invade the country, saying that I'm invading in order to bring democracy, but perhaps I'm invading that country for other reasons, which is what takes place. We have reached a paradox today in which wars are waged in the name of democracy. So I think I made here my point that democracy has been established in the world, but not without problems. And here again, this has to do with various protests and demonstrations that take place in the world today. And the problems are these. What kind of democracy has been established as a democratic value, and insofar, or to what degree, to what extent is this democracy, liberal democracy, does really open a space of legitimation among the demos? That is, democracy that appeals to the demos, to what extent does it actually represent that demos? There are several demonstrations nowadays in the name of a true democracy. Now, having made this preamble, how does the problem of democracy, how is it expressed in the Brazilian context? In the Brazilian context, since the first attempt to establish a democratic regime in the so-called First Republic or Old Republic in Brazil, we have a debate in the academia among several thinkers who came to the conclusion in a nutshell, that the installation and actual consolidation of democracy in Brazil, and this debate is still conducted today, faces three main obstacles. Cultural obstacles, because of our colonization and things that you know. A culture was developed in the country, a culture clientelistic, patrimonialist, personalistic, and therefore a culture that is very unfavorable for the representative institutions, formal and state institutions. There will be also socioeconomic obstacles, which would consist of the immense inequality, illiteracy, misery, which make people to population groups to be very fragile, not to be able to interpret the source of information, so that democracy would be of low quality. And the third factor, which is what interests me here the most, and on which I'm going to delve, are the so-called political institutional factors. There was a debate in which it was said that Brazil has always done very poor choices as far as its constitutional designs are concerned. Beginning with the constitution adopted in the First Republic, it was very much criticized until the constitution of 1946 and the current constitution of 1988. There are several criticisms that allege that we have made a very poor constitutional choice. But the idea is that we have had a succession of constitutional political arrangements that established a pendular dynamics of a pendulum or of oscillations. Sometimes we had centralized fragmented constitutions and therefore more democratic constitutions, and at other occasions we had a closing a tougher and a more authoritarian constitution, which coincides even with the breaks of the regimes that intended to be democratic, or the democratic regime that was established in 1946. What happens is that whenever we try to adopt democratic regimes, as in the First Republic 1946 and 1988 now, we chose constitutional models that were very fragmented. In other words, models that dispersed too much of political power, creating a difficulty for the generation of a national agenda that might be approved by a consistent majority without involving negotiations, corruption, and so forth. These are models that increase a lot the number of actors who have a veto power within the political system. And because of that, from the constitutional point of view, this thesis argues that we'll have always experienced moments of tension between the executive and legislative powers and between the government and opposition, culminating in process of decision-making paralysis, which is Vanderlei Guilherme dos Santos' main point of explanation for the movement of 1964, demonstrations attempts to mobilize the population, to sensitize the Congress, which sometimes makes opposition to government in order to pass certain laws, processes of political radicalization, which ultimately may bring in their wake a new coup d'etat or new forms of concentration of power. In fact, if we look at the constitutional design of Brazil in the present, we're going to see that it is a design that really does fragment power. When we left the authoritarian regime after a slow process of transition, big debate was established in Brazil about the model of constitution that we should adopt in 1988. The concern was not to repeat the constitutional mistakes of 1946. Which, according to the interpretation of political science, were responsible for the paralysis crisis that led to the 1964 coup d'etat, because of the conflict between legislative and executive branch that left the then president no other resort except looking for backing among the population, which led to the military coup. But we adopted the design of 1988, according to various analysts of the period, including especially international researchers that made comparative analysis about Brazil. The concern that was established was precisely the concern that this model that we adopted now in 1988 was a model that repeated almost literally the design of 1946. So we adopted again a presidential form of government when there was a whole movement in favor of parliamentarism. We adopted an electoral system that due to the proportional representation favors the proliferation of political parties, so we have a big fragmentation of political parties in parliament. We also adopted an electoral system that has a personal vote that would establish a personalistic relationship between clientelistic relationships between the politicians and the voters, rather than a party-based universalistic relationship. And as a consequence, we have a political party system that is a multi-party system. And the combination of a multi-party system with presidentialism would be exclusively designed for the great concern of the period, which was governability. A president that doesn't have the majority in parliament will have to resort somehow to the support of other parties. But it is not institutionally guaranteed that these parties will support the government. So the big suspicion was that this system that we adopted, which generate a low governmentability, the president will not be able to have an automatic majority to govern. The ghost of the 1960s, the ghost of 1964 was present in the debates of the beginning of the 1990s. And all analysts said this constitutional design is a threat to the consolidation of democracy in Brazil. We are under the risk of having an authoritarian backlash. To worsen things, we would have adopted a model of federation that would give too much power to the governors, as in the old republic. These governors would also have a lot of veto power vis-a-vis the national policies, and we have a judiciary that has the ability to interfere in politics, because the judiciary has the control of constitutionality, which today is equivalent to the process of judicialization of politics. Now, this is in fact the model design that we adopted. And the concern at that point was that this design would prevent three sets of reforms that Brazil needed, and many say that Brazil still needs them. Brazil, at that point, at the beginning of the 1990s, since the debate that is still conducted today, Brazil would have to make immense reforms to increase the effectiveness of the state. Reforms to change the bureaucracy, the social security, privatizations, which was partly done by the Fernando Henrique Cardoso administration. The financial capacity should be increased. In the 1980s, we had a bankruptcy of the state public policy, so it was necessary to reduce public expenditures, to carry out a tax reform, to improve the revenues of the state, and a general reduction of state expenditures. And the third point would be an increase of the capacity of the executive to approve bills. Because if the executive branch had no capacity to have the bills approved, it would not be able to carry out those state reforms. And the executive would have to have a capacity to approve bills to have a political governability. But the constitutional design that we adopted did not give the executive branch this capacity. So as soon as the Constitution of 1988 was passed, we had demonstrations for political reform on the very next day. People asked for changes in the system because the executive needs more power and the political system is too fragmented. You have 6 more minutes. So the diagnosis that was made by political science in these 30 years, from 1990s to the present, refuted a lot of these pessimistic theses based on the idea of a constitutional design that would prevent governability. There are data, empirical studies conducted that show that the presidents, with the exception of Fernando Collor, and that's why he was impeached, but the system did not break because of that. The system was able to resist the president, suffered an impeachment. I apologize to the interpreters. The data show that the presidents were able to form majority coalitions in the legislative, to the contrary of what had been predicted. The president, differently from 1946, the president had legislative powers. They could interfere in the legislative process. The president gained very rich instruments to be able to control the agenda of legislature, which is the issuing of provisional decisions. The president has certain control over the agenda. He can decree very urgent bills and very urgent and extremely urgent bills. When I take the certain bill out of the plenary, I can accelerate the legislative process, and the data show that besides forming majority coalitions with political parties, the presidents managed, along with the leaders of the political parties, to make the members of parliament to behave in a very disciplined way. There was no use of political party to make an alliance if the parliamentarians would vote against it, but they did vote in a disciplined manner. So this set of research projects showed that there was a cooperative relationship between legislative and executive rather than an conflict. This was coined as presidentialism of coalition, which meant that although we have a presidentialist system, we operate with a logic that is very similar to the logic of the parliamentary system. Because of one detail, we have a multi-party system. Multi-party parliamentary systems must also make coalitions. Where the parliamentarian systems don't make a coalition, there are only two parties. The majority party wins the election and nominates the prime minister. So the combination of presidentialism and a multi-party system was a good combination, because just as the multi-party parliamentarism, it created incentives, although not anchored in the Constitution, but it created informal incentives for the formation of coalitions. And therefore, just as in multi-party advanced parliamentarist democracies, the governments are formed through the distribution of positions, like in Denmark, for instance. In Brazil, too, this happened in the same way. And that's why the presidents, if they knew how to play that game, they were able to govern. This data here show that actually since the Sarney administration up to the Dilma administration, increasingly the presidents added political parties to their support bases. Look how in front, Fernando Collor de Mello had only the support of very few political parties. He was unable to stay in government. In the Itamar Franco administration, the Fernando Henrique Cardoso administration, the number of parties increased. In the Lula administration, this was even broadened, and the Dilma administration, that's that. The problem is not of the Dilma administration is not having a support in parliament, but her problem is to have too much support, too many parties supporting her. My time is almost over, but this is in the arena of government, and the electoral arena, and I said I would also assess this arena, but in the electoral arena, if you look at the degree of adherence of voters measured by the participation in the elections, the degree of public contestation, I'm not thinking of contestation on the streets, but through political parties. And when I look at the alignment of this competition is established, we'll see what these 30 years of democracy produced in this arena, which was this. First, in this period, there was really a great, significant increase of the population, followed by a significant increase of the number of voters. This graph, that has only one line, shows the evolution of the percentage of voters among the total of the Brazilian population. One can see that the proportion increases and accompanies the aging of the population. Today we have around 71% of the population is made up of voters and participate in the elections. Another important data is this, the abstentions and attendance to the polls. Since 1994, the attendance is here shown in orange, and then the abstentions in white. You can see that we have a very high level of attendance, of course, because voting in Brazil is obligatory, but it actually is not. If you don't vote, almost nothing happens to you. The fine is very small. It is a more or less symbolic obligation. So it is a very high rate of participation by people, which is perhaps even a paradox, because at the same time as the polls show that there is not a lot of valuing of the institution, political parties and the Congress have a poor assessment evaluation, but people continue to participate in the electoral process. Void abstentions are shown in gray. There is no significant oscillation. Since 1998, we have something around 32% of the is the sum of abstentions and blank votes. So we have a very high level of abstention. So the second set of data, if you allow me, Cattani, has to do with the aspect of competition that shows the standard, the pattern of a national competition. Brazil is a very complex reality. Each municipality has its own political logic, and each state. So I'm looking only at politics at the national level. Now, looking at the dispute for the presidency in the first rounds of elections, I added here the number of votes of the candidates that had a coalition around the candidate of the PT, the Workers' Party, and the PSDB, Social Democratic Party, and the third force, which always changes. Ciro Gomes, Garotinho, and now Marina Silva in the last election. And then the other candidates. We can see that all of the other candidates have a very low number of votes, and the number of votes for president actually concentrates already in the first round in the two big national parties that really polarize the dispute, the PT and the PSDB. This here, for instance, no, this is going to be confusing. I'll have to give a long explanation. This here, for instance, shows the concentration of electoral competition for the presidency, which is a quite clear evidence of the political and party political polarizations that we have. We have actually two kinds of polarizations. Adding up PSDB and the third force, in the presidential election, in the first round of the election, they concentrate always more than 85% of the votes. So the national dispute for the presidency is not actually a multi-party dispute. It's very much concentrated on a very few parties. When I compare only PT and PSDB, I have another important data that shows that besides being concentrated on this polarization, over time, the difference of votes between these two parties is reduced, gradually reduced, which shows that the competition for the voters between these parties is becoming increasingly fierce, pointing to a horizon of a very strong dispute in the next elections. And I close here because otherwise I would go too long. Now, just to conclude now, I always prepare more things that I'm able to say, but now, to conclude, so what? What are the advances? I'm going to just mention each one of them. Advances, I put up this list together with various colleagues spread throughout Brazil. But this is a consensus that is advanced from the. I'm making an evaluation assessment from the constitutional point of view, from the point of view of the political system. Advances in electoral processes that are increasingly well organized, they are inclusive, have a higher level of participation, and are honest. Today there is a debate about the electronic ballots, but these have still a very honest competition. There's a high competition, which is essential for democracy. There are guarantees for the activity of oppositions within the normal parameters of any democracy in the world, so the opposition parties are not blocked. The parties structure the electoral and governmental process if they, whether they obtain legitimacy among the population is something else. But from the point of view of structuring the electoral process, of structuring the government, these parties have been effective. There is a cooperative relationship between the powers, and the political rights are guaranteed and are in place. And what are the challenges, very briefly? There is a low legitimacy of representative editions among the population, which is a paradox, because at the same time, the institutions as such have been strengthened, but they don't have, the legitimacy is low. There's a negative perception about the political process. The population has an increasingly negative perception of the political process, but this is not exclusively Brazilian. You can see this worldwide. There is a difficulty in the operation of the government coalitions. The coalitions sometimes involve resources that bring denunciations of corruption, which undermines the process, the governance process. We have the freedom of press is actually reduced as a consequence of the oligopolistic distribution of the means of communication. There is a growing influence of money on electoral campaigns. There is the discourse of the political parties are anachronistic over against the changes of the recent years. There is a lack of connection between the representative system and the new social demands or claims. And finally, there is a agenda that is demanding political reforms again. So I conclude with a question. Will the political reforms solve the problem? I just raised this question for our debate.
Conseguiste abrir leque maior ainda de questões, então vai dar trabalho dobrado para o debatedor. Então, convido a professora Lorena para a terceira exposição dessa tarde.
Well, now we are going to have our next lecture. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this table. I'm very pleased with that. And as Elisa, I also thought how to address the redemocratization issue during the last 30 years in Brazil. And I think my situation is not very comfortable because after almost 4 days of intense debates and the presentation of extremely relevant topics, maybe for me it is left to become repetitive about what has been said. But I also think I will have some new things to propose for discussion. When we talk about redemocratization, we refer to a former moment when democracy stopped existing in Brazil from the 64 to 85. But talking about redemocratization, it means to address something that has already happened, stopped happening, and it was renovated. When was that? 45 to 64, 20 years of democracy, then 20 years of not democracy, and then redemocratization. What kind of democracy was that? We are not going to discuss that because several issues have been already discussed in terms of historic reconstruction. But we are going to try to think about what democracy are we going to talk about, or what redemocratization are we referring to. We have seen during the last weeks movements on behalf of democracy, putting or discussing democracy is a problem because everyone demands democracy, but the perspective of what is democracy is very different. We can summarize saying that the current democracy, it is ensured by an institutional stability. Professor Paulo has clearly explained what kind of democracy we are referring to. The institutionality is key for that. The formal aspects related to elections, clean, periodical, with no problems, partidary. Referring to redemocratization, we have to think of a process of transition. It is a transition from a dictatorial period to a period of democratic with also political advances. And talking about transition, short essay from Florestan Fernandes, the professor, scares new war, not the results with the elections. For instance, in the life in cities, what are we doing in cities with acceptance of the mayors? The cities are being sold for real estate speculation. But this has, and that there are some other movements still in Porto Alegre, the movement for the cultural and...
This inhibiting potential questions. So please answer Thales' question. Lorena.
Uma coisa que pode ser que é o imponderável.
What can happen is what we don't expect. Something else, what we would like to happen. We would like to governments, Lula administrations, and Lula administration, some sensitive issues in society were debated, were worked on, were dealt with. And even there was something done in terms of income distribution, although we don't have effective results. Anyway, these topics got into the Open University, for instance. So some important topics have been discussed. I ask, my question is this: insofar as these important topics for society have been discussed, does that somehow reflect on a possibility of a compromising of our democracy as a result? So we had this election now in which Dilma was elected. There were manifestations questioning, challenging the legitimacy of her election because most of her votes came from one region and another. This is a result of a political process that is underway. My question is whether in this political process that is underway, some actual accomplishments actually they have occurred in terms putting into perspective aspects of these reasons by the elites. How can we problematize the different democratizing access to the media. How can the pro-market discourse, a scheme of a liberal interpretation of society, it defends market mechanisms, but when the idea is to take more market to the media sector, they resist. So what are the difficulties for the insertion of social research into these fields of resistance by the elites? Further questions? Professor Elisa.
First of all, I'd like to comment your intervention. I talked about the roots of the authoritarian period, but I'm kind of scared of being connected to, you have to explain change and continuity, and somehow our authoritarian period is reinvented continuously due to different interests along the time. I do not know if I would say if the Brazilian elite feels hate. Or, I think every elite tries to keep their own participation, but this strong manifestation has less to do with elite and more to do with the medium class, because they are on they are under, and they are scared of losing their space. I think we have made progress. We are elitist, but along the last years, we had a renovation of the elites. If I think of the elite, not only the ones who have money, but the ones who manipulate resources, there was a great increase of that, and measuring the elite is, we see that it's less connected than the elite in several countries. 10 years ago, I studied Brazil, South Africa, Bangladesh, and the Brazil was the least. It was the least connected elite in every sense. Nowadays, it is even stronger because there was a renovation of the elites. But less than being afraid of the hate of the elite, we should look at what sensitizes the elite. And there was this process. The new medium class, I think, is the new low class, in fact, has presented to the elite something new. The elite likes the broadening, the increase of the consumption market. We have the idea that if distributing, we still grow more. Is something limited, but is a new view. There's the scare, the fright, the protection, but is also the interest. If the elite believes that it's important to increase the middle class, they will bet in them. I would also like to comment the threats to democracy, that issue. I'm not afraid of the recent movement of questioning the legality of the elections. We remember that along the period of Fernando Henrique, there was the Fernando Henrique out or movements against him. I don't think these threats the democratic structures in Brazil. Of course, in the immediate context after the elections, this has consequences, but they will keep on saying, go out Dilma, as they used to say, go out Fernando Henrique. But there's the difficulties that we face. I think that when we study or we do research on a controversial topic, we can help Trojans or Greeks. It depends on how you design your research project. If you start and say, I'm here to be against the monopoly of education, communication, but if you say, I want to understand how is the structure of the communication in Brazil. The knowledge produced is an enormous gain. Who is going to use this knowledge is another issue, but you have done what you could do, that is to give light to that topic. It is true that we are far from having great conquerors, but we have some that we have to value a lot. And I would like also to use this opportunity to do some marketing here. The research was in September next year, we are going to have the World Forum of Social Sciences in South Africa. The call for papers was launched, or is going to be launched next week, and it is a good opportunity for us to be present. And I remember that when Victor mentioned challenges, because this social forum is not academic only. Academic are the main characters, let's say, but it is a forum for people who consumes science. All kinds of interested actors in what we produce or what we want them to be interested. This is going to be the third World Science Forum. We had one in Norway, another in Canada, and the topic is justice and social equality. I invite you to visit our site.
Acho que algumas coisas que eu ia falar já acabou que foram faladas. Talvez eu acrescentaria talvez um detalhe na questão.
Perhaps I would like to add a detail to the answer to the issue of the reaction by the so-called Brazilian elite vis-à-vis the great social mobility that we had in previous years, not only in terms of income, but also in educational terms, like access to the university. And here I tend to agree, but this is just one perception. It seems to me that there is a greater resistance by the higher middle class than by the elites of the very rich ones that probably don't move around in these environments. The very rich people send their children to do undergraduate studies abroad and don't circulate in this environment. So it's probably a threat to the higher middle class, or a middle class, if we can make this distinction, which perhaps feels threatened symbolically because now these people, the other people circulate, and perhaps also financially because probably, I don't have data, Cattani works more on that, but probably this concentration of income that has been happening, that there was a concentration among the very rich ones, perhaps the higher and middle class has not been so much favored. There's the dynamics of income distribution in Brazil, because at the same time you had income distribution and concentration at the same time. Distribution promoted the mobility of very poor people, but at the same time there was a concentration of income among the very rich, and perhaps the traditional middle class, the middle and higher middle class ended up losing the most. So the poor ones gained something, the very rich gained a lot, and in the middle of that, the traditional middle class has perhaps lost. In here I have a view that is similar to Cattani's view, but I don't know whether on the same at the same level. But regarding a growing hatred that is being expressed since the election of 2010 and surfaces in the electoral process, and now in 2014, as far as I could see, became much more visible, which is a hatred that is expressed in a vague way as a hatred against the PT, the Workers' Party. What I think what is behind it, and this involves some things that Cattani mentioned, this is a hatred against what the PT represents in terms of advances in certain policies that directly affect moral issues. I think there is here a hatred that comes from conservative groups that is perhaps not related to income, because there are conservative people in all levels of education, of income. I don't know where this conservatism comes from, but probably it does exist in all income classes. Now, if we take the past 12 years, it's undeniable that there has been advances in terms of the inclusion of groups that were completely excluded from the process, not only of consumption, but also from the university. The creation of quotas for the universities. There have been debates that were considered minorities, but were somehow had their demands fulfilled, like the LGBT people. Whereas the candidate Marina had included that in that program, she had to remove the LGBT issues from her government program because she was pressured by conservative groups. The first request for impeachment of President Dilma and the return to the authoritarian regime, and who I was there by chance. I was in São Paulo, and I ended up watching and filming that. And I was impressed with the amount of young people, because that's something important. Conservatism seemed to, we seem to be in the following situation. With the development of society, socio-economic development, access to education, conservatism would be removed, but that did not happen. These are young people. One could realize that there's some college, university students, many of them from the middle class, and who were holding banners and posters defending Jair Bolsonaro and things like that. So there is, we do have, yes, a different conservatism that is being reorganized in Brazil, but this is an echo of an extreme right-wing movement that is getting organized all over the world. And I have the suspicion that this has reached Brazil. I think the first question, there was a question about the emergence of these movements and what does that, what that means. I would say this is a side effect of democracy. Actually, both the demonstrations in 2013 and these groups that are on the street now, I agree with Elisa, are movements that are allowed, acceptable within democracy, welcomed within democracy, because there's something important, which I think it was an illusion by the left wing. The left wing is now getting disillusioned or disappointed, but this disappointment means the acceptance of a principle of reality, which means this, not necessarily because people are part of what we call people, that doesn't mean that they are not conservative. That not necessarily every Democrat is a left-wing Democrat. There are right-wing democratic and conservative people. And in the same way, as Dilma was elected with a program, she was not elected alone. A Congress was elected. This is what I tried to discuss when I presented the institutional design. She was elected together with a Congress in which there are certain political parties, just as the Jair Bolsonaro himself was the candidate that got largest number of votes. Some people have been elected, were elected who are not rich, although money is essential in democracy nowadays, and Dilma has to govern in this situation. So something that has to become clear, and this is a disillusionment for the population in general, but this is a learning in terms of democracy, because the democracy that we have is the one that is before our eyes. This is the democracy that the elites want, but President Dilma must govern with that Congress and with these political parties that do have a representativity or representativeness because they were elected. We have to accept the fact that the right-wing representatives were elected and they do have a force. When there is an electoral campaign, the candidates present proposals, but this is clearly a fallacy. Why? How can a president, be it Aécio or Marina, Aécio Neves or Marina Silva, how can a president guarantee that they are going to put that program into practice if they have to form a coalition in order to govern? There is no way. To form a coalition means to give up part of your program and to nominate people to the ministries. And some people may say this is bad. Well, that depends on the angle from the point of view. There are people who say the present Congress is more conservative. I agree. But now to conclude that the Congress became worse, I would say worse for whom? For those who are on the left wing, it became worse. But for those who are on the right wing, it hasn't become worse. So this is the difficulty of democratic coexistence. We have to accept the fact that there is a right wing. We have to establish limits for the extreme right that wants to tumble the system. But if we accept the extreme left, who also wants to tumble the system, it's because the other right defends humanitarian policies, but it's it's anti-system. Now, I try to imagine what Dilma is suffering in order to put up a program, because after all, she did not want to give up those programs, but she has to make a deal, because we have a model in which you have to create a coalition to build a majority. And this is perhaps not bad from the democratic point of view. Let's think the other way around. Let's assume that a highly conservative president had been elected, and he or she could govern the way he or she wanted. We'd like to have some left-wing groups that would be part of the ministry of that president in order to avoid that. So I think this is a sign of the strengthening of our democracy in this model of democracy that we have.
It was not clear for me the question that has been made regarding the possible negative results of the implementation of some social policies, the university, reduction of poverty. But if I understood it right, I would say only that there's not a mechanical result or mechanical relationship of the those benefited by the policies of a favorable answer from the governments that have sponsored these policies. It's not that. There are several other elements that are inserted in the building, the development of the politics from the parties. I'm not sure if that was the question made. Regarding to the difficulties of social surveys on the resistance to democracy, the ones who have tried that know that it is difficult, as it is difficult also to go to a plant, to a bank, or to a company to do the research or the survey. Sometimes you have to use several means and alternatives to get to the people who can help you to develop that survey or research. Well, we are going to close this extremely diversified session. We had objective, deep, complementary analysis. We are concluding the seminar as the best way we could. We thank the lecturers, and I would like to ask now the persons who organized this seminar to have our formal closing.
Só em nome do PPG. E vocês em nome do seminário. Bem, chegamos ao final.
Well, we are getting to the end of one more seminar. On behalf of the graduation program in sociology, I'd like to thank you all for your presence, also the organizing committee for the effort, the devotion to organize this seminar, the team that have supported us all the time. I would like also to thank the agencies that made this seminar possible, especially the CAPES with the Program of School of High Studies and ProEx that helped funding part of what was not covered by the School of High Studies. I'd like to thank the graduation program on philosophy and anthropology for the support, and also the graduation program on social sciences of PUC, our partner university. I'd like to highlight the protagonism of our program, graduation program, and to the initiatives it is taken along the last years with relevant themes that we have to debate and reflect on these different theme spectrums. I remember how bold we were. Remember, Raquel, when organizing an event to celebrate the centennial of Durkheim, the elementary forms of religious life. We were bold because Durkheim is a classic, and they had a whole week on debates on the book after, and it was a success. Then we were bold again, and we discussed another topic now from a different perspective, the BRICS. It was another very important topic. What are the BRICS? What is the role of Brazil in the BRICS? And we brought sociologists from China, from India, from South Africa, and we spent a whole week discussing the role of BRICS, sociology in the BRICS, and in this discussing the global world. And this year we thought, well, the graduation course has to bring to debate one topic that is important, current, and we came to this contestation. What was the meaning of these movements in 2013? What was, there was no doubt that this topic has been discussed in the research groups. Marcelo was filming, discussing, Raquel also. But what is important for us, and here I say that the graduation program has a protagonism, is to bring this reflection that we have in our program on sociology, to bring it to the audience in general, to our colleagues from other areas, and to the audience in general, debates, reflections, issues. We don't want to get to any solution, we don't know, but it is important to have, well, contestation has happened, it is happening. What is the role of these in our social reality today, especially in Brazil? But we've seen that it's not only a Brazilian problem, it happens everywhere in the world. There are different perspectives of understanding the problem. The own movements express themselves in different ways. But I was really pleased, and I think that this seminar has brought and has shown the relevance of this phenomenon and how it can be addressed, and how we can reflect on that from different perspectives, from different sociological, epistemological, empirical perspectives. And the dialogue is just beginning. We are going to keep on discussing, talking, maybe in another moment with other important topics. We are not going to stop here. Thank you all for your presence, and see you in the next seminar or event.
I would also like to reinforce all the words of thanks that she said, and I'd like to thank once again all our guests who accepted the challenge of participating in this event, some coming from very close, from Porto Alegre, and some coming from very far. We know how complicated it is to change your agenda, get away from your daily activities for a whole week to devote fully to the participation in this event. So, special word of thanks to each one of you. First, for having accepted the invitation, and then for your immense contribution that you brought to our debate. I am sure that this is a debate that will continue. I was very happy with the interaction that took place during these days, an interaction that occurred here and the following moments during transportation as we came from the hotel to the university. I think a group was created through this exchange of ideas and experiences, and I'm sure that this contact will last beyond this moment here. I would also like to thank the professors who acted as moderators in the session. Evidently, I would like to thank the audience. Without you, this event would have no meaning at all. I'd also like to thank to the colleagues of the coordinating committee, which we have been working together now for a whole year, so you can imagine how much had to be done during this year. So a word of thanks to you too. I also thank the members of the executive committee. I thank all the volunteers who have been working day and night to collaborate with us. I thank the people of the audio-visual team, internet transmission. I would like to remind you that this event is not only being transmitted broadcast live, but it will stay on our site. And later on, we are going to edit a DVD, high definition, in perfect shape, and we're going to send the DVD to the graduate studies programs that have partnerships with us. So I take this opportunity to thank the programs, and also I thank the audience that followed us at a distance. We heard from various people who followed us. I also thank the interpreters. We know that it's not easy to follow us during these days, and I hope that, in fact, this event that we planned with so much dedication and effort really has produced the fruits that we wanted to produce, to enable a moment of reflection about the meaning of democracy in the contemporary context. What are its challenges? What is the role of civil society? In which way the various kinds of contestation are articulated with these issues? I'm sure that we will leave this room not necessarily with more answers, perhaps with even more questions, which I think is quite interesting. I think this is precisely the idea, not necessarily to find answers, but to deepen our reflection. So then I will now give the floor to Marcelo. Well, I think there's nothing left to say, actually. Except thank you. So hereby I close this event. Thank you very much.
Valeu, Marcelo. Obrigada, Marcelo. Deu tudo certo. Foi de fato um prazer. Sobrevivemos ao dinheiro também, né?